Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our last installment on the Adult Orthodox Education series that the Outreach and Evangelism Committee has put together. We've talked about, in our first session, baptism and the prayers that go with the birth of a child and the 40-day blessing. The second lecture we had was done by Father Angelo Mago from Assumption Church in Flint, who spoke about the Divine Liturgy and the Holy Eucharist. The third session was on the healing ministries of the Church, including unction, confession, and prayers in the hospital. Last week we had Father Sean Gavastas from Plymouth, from the Nativity Church in Plymouth, Nativity of the Virgin Mary Church in Plymouth, who spoke to us on the sacrament of marriage and on weddings. And now we have Father Anthony Cook from St. George Church in Southgate, Michigan, who's going to speak to us on funerals and death. And of course, this is an important topic. It's something that we all have to deal with at some point or another. Father Anthony was born in Arizona, and then he came to school in Michigan, where he converted to Orthodoxy, and went to Holy Cross, graduated from Holy Cross, and was ordained to the diaconate and to the priesthood by St. Metropolitan Nicholas. Served at Assumption Church in St. Clair Shores for a while. Then he went by himself to Rochester, New York, to the Annunciation Parish in Rochester, and then he went to the Assumption Church with the Annunciation in Memphis. And now he's at St. George taking head of the church after Father Catamounts' retirement. He's one of our brightest priests in the metropolis. He always speaks well. We've had him here on several occasions, and so we're glad to welcome him once again to St. Nicholas. Thank you, Father.
Thank you, Father.
Well, I sometimes make the joke that I was ordained 6 years ago, and it took me that long to get away from Panagia. Because I was at Kinesis, I was at Annunciation, and I was at Annunciation. It's not a very good joke. Nobody ever laughs at my jokes anyway. So we're talking about death. Oh, I should apologize for my attire. This is my coat. It's not that I expect a chilly reception. It's not that I'm cold, but I am just coming from vacation, and I forgot my suit coat. So if I didn't wear this, I feel naked. Thank you for bearing with me. So we're talking about death and the funeral service. And as I know you've already heard about all of the other, or several of the other sacraments and services that mark our progress through life, it's worthwhile to compare the funeral to them, not least because most of the other services we look at are categorized as sacraments. And the funeral service, in a certain sense, is unusual in that most frequently it is not. It doesn't have the usual hallmarks and characteristics of a sacrament. There is no prayer for blessing, for transformation in and of itself. That doesn't mean that the service is devoid of the sacramental character, but its sacramentality, if you will, is connected to and really derived from all of the others. The funeral service, in short, is intended for those who have lived their lives in a positive relationship with the Church as experienced through and expressed in the sacraments of baptism, Holy Communion, confession, and marriage, to list the ones that are most commonly and broadly experienced by your average Orthodox Christian. What I'm really trying to convey then is that when we look at the funeral service and all of the rules that can sometimes seem very arbitrary associated with the funeral, it is important that we understand it as prescriptive and not proscriptive, by which I mean it is telling us in a positive sense how we should move through this process of death, of grieving, of preparation, of burial, and of remembrance. It is not intended to be proscriptive, which is to say, forbidding us to do the things that we often want to do. On the same token, usually we come upon these issues in a context where proscription ends up being required. Someone will ask perhaps to speak, to give a eulogy in the church. A member of the family will ask to give a few remarks for their loved one. And a priest in this metropolis always is compelled to refuse because we're not permitted to do that. The understanding in the church that is enforced by His Eminence Metropolitan Nicholas is that the church, and speaking in the church, is intended to be, well, it really is the responsibility of the bishop and then of those to whom he gives permission to preach, which is usually the clergy. But it's odd for us sometimes because we see in other churches that the loved ones do stand up and give a eulogy. They, speak some words of remembrance for their loved one. So again, we encounter this when we sometimes come to the church and ask for what we want, what we think would be nice in the course of the funeral service, and then we're told no. And we experience that as proscriptive, as negative, as a refusal to allow us to do what we want to do. One of the other issues, again, that comes up frequently, and more frequently, is the question of cremation. People will say, does the church allow cremation? And that's an odd way to phrase the question in a certain sense, because the church doesn't have any authority to forbid cremation. You can do whatever you want, but when you come and bring your loved one to the church for burial, then there is a prescription, a guide of how we will move through this process in a way that will give us words to grieve, that will give us the closure, the encounter with death in a very frank manner, really, and the opportunity to see, having passed through the valley of the shadow of death, the light and the hope of Christ, our risen Lord. But that doesn't really come through in that immediate conversation with the family who is perhaps dealing with a will in which their mother or father, their aunt or uncle stipulated that they were to be cremated, and yet the family desires that they have the funeral in the church. And then the priest says, no, I'm sorry, if you do the cremation, I can't perform the funeral, and then there are hurt feelings at a most vulnerable time of life. I mention these two examples because I think they are common. Certainly I've encountered them more times than I expected in my still short priesthood. I'm sure Father Nick, you've encountered these as well. And understanding from the beginning what may be the terms under which we see the rules of the church as negative. Let's look at what is the positive expectation of the church, and hopefully then understand in the context of that why cremation is not permitted in the context of an Orthodox funeral, why the family do not come and speak their memories of the dearly departed, and so on. So you have already, those of you who attend here, you've seen already this booklet probably many times, and the first page gives, really the first 2 or 3 pages give a basic outline of what happens in the course of a funeral service. So if we sum up, when an Orthodox Christian dies, there is, of course, first expected in their last days or hours that they will have a visit from the priest. They will request the priest to visit. The priest doesn't necessarily know automatically that they are nearing their death, so it's incumbent on them or their family to call. We already spoke about this, though, so I don't need to go into it. There is that last, often and hopefully last confession, that last communion, anointing with the chela, and then they pass. Sometimes, even in the hospital then, as soon as life is gone, the priest may be called and a Chrisaihin service may be done. And in a practical sense, although it's sometimes hard on the priest, and sometimes it's difficult for the family. That can be a very striking transition. If the priest is there at the moment of death and is praying the prayers for the healing of soul and body, even as he prays for the parting of the soul from the body. And then 5 minutes later, the breath, the life, the pulse are gone. And that person for whom we were praying as a living, breathing member of the body of Christ, we now pray for their departed soul as they are embraced by the Lord and his angels in death. And that, I'm sure you've seen this again, Father, that it can sometimes be very striking. It brings home to the family members that their loved one is dead. And it begins them on the process of preparing the funeral, of beginning to grieve, and of moving through this new reality that they have. It's not required, however, for this to be done. It's really when the family asks for it, that the priest will go and say the Trisagion service for the newly departed. They are brought to the funeral home, they are dressed, they are cleaned, they are prepared for burial. And then the night before the funeral, usually, there will be the visitation, the family will be there, and the priest will come and do again the Trisagion service, or for the first time the Trisagion service in preparation for the funeral. And the Trisagion is really only a 5 to 10 minutes worth of a service. You've all experienced it before. It has a few hymns, a few prayers, and a few petitions for the departed, that they may find rest in the embrace of the saints, in the bosom of Abraham, where there is no pain, no sorrow, no suffering, but only everlasting life. And then, ideally, usually, preferably, that service concludes the visitation. It comes toward the end. It helps the family to, again, ideally, the service comes at the end. It closes out their mourning period there at the funeral home, and they can go to their homes to rest, to sleep, and to prepare for the funeral the next morning. One stipulation at the funeral home is that the norm, the expectation, is that the casket will be open. The relic, the remains of the one who has died, should be visible. The intent is not to be macabre, not to be morbid, but rather that as we are grieving our loved one, we face them as they lie there in death. We see both the beauty of their face, the one whom we loved, and we see what cannot be described as anything other than the horror of their body still and lifeless, empty of the soul that had given it life. It is our opportunity to face death, to see it in all of its ugliness. And for all that funeral directors and their art are quite advanced, there is no disguising that horror. The same is true in the church. The norm, except for in extraordinary circumstances, which is to say, if the death was a violent one, in fire or in a crash of some sort, and there is not enough of the body left to be visible, to have the casket open, then again the casket should be open in the church, so that as we grieve within the four walls of the church, we still are faced on the one hand with the beauty of our loved one, with the horror of their dead body, and with the hope of the resurrection in the icon set before us. And we see all three of these things at once. And really that sums up the funeral service itself. In the funeral service we have words that speak of the love that we feel for the one who has died. We have words that speak of the agony of the loss. And we have words that speak of the hope that we have in the resurrection of Christ Jesus our Lord, and the expectation that we will see our loved one again. And really, I I can almost sum up the service, with that. It is neither too sorrowful on the one hand, nor is it too joyful on the other. And oftentimes, it is difficult for us by ourselves to walk that line, to hold on to both hope and to experience the full measure of sorrow when we are faced with any loss, and most especially when we are faced with death. It is a all too common tendency when someone dies to give the cliche, they're in a better place, you can say. Oh, God must have had a reason to take him, you can say. Or now his soul is with the stars, perhaps, which I've heard in these conversations. Or, death is really a good thing because now their soul is with Jesus. And that means that death is good and you shouldn't be sad. But on the other hand, you have the funerals in which there is no hope evident. You have the excess of grief that considers it to be a permanent loss, in which there is wailing and screaming and all manner of carrying on, if you will. And that too is to slip to one side or to the other of the narrow way that the church gives to us of grieving. But that grief is really summed up by St. Paul in the epistle. And again, when we consider what is the character of the funeral service, what is the prescription that the church gives to us, it is what Paul says in his epistle. He says, "Brethren, I do not want you to be ignorant about those who have fallen asleep, so that you will not grieve like those who have no hope." He does not say that we should not grieve. Neither does he say that we should grieve absolutely. We grieve as those who have hope of a better future, who have hope that this end is not the end. And then, to hurry and wrap up, because I don't want to talk too long, following the reading of the epistle and the gospel, which give assurance of the resurrection from the dead, then we conclude the service. We anoint the body of the departed with oil and with earth, and then we close the casket. And in the normal practice, in the Greek Archdiocese at least, it is not opened again. There is an older tradition that often would have had that anointing with the oil and the earth done at the cemetery immediately before the interment, and sometimes that is still done. But normally, I've never seen it done that way in the Greek Archdiocese. It seems that the common norm is that the casket is closed for the final time within the church. Then the departed processes out and is brought to the cemetery where they were buried. At the cemetery, the service that is done is once again the Trisagion, that shorter service, and then the casket is lowered into the ground, the earth is placed on it, and that is not actually the end. The Makaria meal is intrinsically a part of the process. I've seen it omitted on a couple of occasions, usually for financial reasons, but I always, and because of the financial reasons, I don't argue, but I always regret that the family didn't find a way even just to meet themselves for a meal afterward, because that is the appropriate, the traditional context for those words of memory, those stories to be told, for the family to speak on behalf of the loved one. And that is a good and appropriate thing. So, that is in short then I forgot. Before the anointing with the oil and the earth, but after the conclusion of the service, or sometimes after the gospel, the priest will then preach. And we sometimes will call that the eulogy, but it's not referred to in that way in the service books. The intent is not, or at least not only, to speak about and remember the one who has departed, but rather it is to preach the gospel, to preach the truth of the church, the truth of Christ, the good news of life to those who are mourning. Oftentimes that sermon then will be perhaps to actively juxtapose the casket on the one hand and the icon of the resurrection on the other, to bring to the forefront what is present in the funeral service, life and death, and our expectation that through death, at the end of death, again, is everlasting life. Not that death is good, death is never good, but death becomes for us the gateway into everlasting life, because only those who have died can be raised. Although even Paul says, we will not all die. We who survive until the coming of the Lord will in no way meet him ahead of those who have fallen asleep. So, at the very least, if you want to meet Christ first, you have to die. If you're still living, you'll have to wait your turn. It's supposed to be a joke, but oh well. So, having run through then broadly the prescription, why we do what we do, or rather what we do, the reasons then that the family members aren't allowed to speak in the church about the departed, that cremation is not permitted, that the closed casket is not permitted, we should discuss those if at the very least briefly. The reason that cremation is not permitted really becomes a lens for us to understand what everything that we do in the church means. That open the casket, for one thing, the offering of incense around the casket, around the relic of the one who has departed, the anointing with oil and earth, and the kissing of the body of the departed by the priest and by those who are grieving. These are all essential actions of the funeral service that are lost when a cremation is done. They are actions that have a deep and abiding meaning. They are the way in which we express, in which we act out our expectation, our hope of the resurrection. If the remains of the departed is just trash to be burnt and disposed of, we would not kiss it, we would not sense it, we would not anoint it, we would not embrace it, we would not bring it within the church, feet first, as the departed walks to his own funeral in a certain sense, coming in feet first and going out feet first, and standing with feet towards the altar, present and active at their own funeral. All of these actions, all of these elements of the funeral are destroyed when a cremation is done. Now, sometimes people hear the priest say, you can't do a cremation, and they say, what? And they say, why? And the priest says, well, because cremation denies the resurrection, which is essentially what we're saying. We do all of these positive things with the body as an expression of our hope and expectation of the resurrection. We can't do them with a cremated urn with the ashes, and therefore cremation is an act that denies the resurrection. People say, what? So you're saying that if there's a cremation, then my loved one won't rise from the dead? No, that's not mine to say. That's not the church's to say. Who rises from the dead is Christ's business. And indeed we hear that all will rise, the righteous and the wicked, and will go to their place of judgment. So, if there is a cremation, this does not make any statement about the final state of the departed. Broadly speaking, the church does not claim sure and certain knowledge of the disposition of a soul after death, whether in heaven or in hell. Some have, said this, some still do, but generally speaking, the Church leaves such matters to God, as is appropriate. We don't have full knowledge of anything, much less of everything like that. So, to go back to the beginning then, that forbidding of an Orthodox funeral for those who are cremated is connected essentially with their relationship with the Church. The funeral is intended for those who have lived a life of communion in the Church, not just those who have been baptized, not just those who have been married, not just those who have received communion once or twice, but those whose life has been immersed in the saving waters of the Church, not just the waters of baptism, but the metaphorical waters that are this communal life in Christ that we share. In this communion, in this community, in these fellowships that we call churches. But to elect to be cremated in denial of the Church's understanding, the Church's prescription for mourning and for death, and in rejection of the Church's communion, because this is essentially what is present in that choice to be cremated, knowing that cremation is not something that the Church can then do a funeral for, is to break that communion. Again, not to say that salvation is undermined or lost, but on the same token, it really is not worth even going there, because one can say yes, one can say no, one can go into all sorts of arguments, but that's not our place. Salvation is in God's hands. Whether or not we can do a funeral in the Church is, again, connected to that active relationship in the course of life, which is why we don't do funerals for anyone who comes. If, for instance, your friend, the Presbyterian, dies, and you say, well, why don't you tell your family that you want to be buried in the Orthodox Church, because they really do a humdinger of a funeral. It's not really going to fly. You're going to come to the priest and say, so my buddy's going to be buried in the church, and he's going to say, what now? Is he Orthodox? And you say, no, but he likes the Orthodox funeral service. Well, why didn't he become Orthodox when he was living? He liked his friend and his friends and his religion. He didn't really believe in all of this. Well, he didn't believe in it, but he wanted to be buried in the church. And this is how the conversation goes. But again, because the expectation of the Church, the action of the funeral expresses a reality of life, a relationship that should have been, well, not should have been, that is understood to have been ongoing in the life of the one who was departed. If that life is absent, then things become much more complicated. So, those are a few of the various things that we may say when cremation comes up. Speaking in the church now, the family, I'm guessing you're running low on time now, right? Okay. Why don't we allow the family to speak in church? The easy answer is, well, the bishop says no, and the priest is bound to do what the bishop says, and that is a good answer, and it is a true answer, but the priest is also responsible not to throw the bishop under the bus. And say, it's his fault, not mine. I would do it, but the bishop said, that's not a helpful attitude. There are a few reasons why not. The first is associated with what is the topic of the funeral sermon supposed to be? Is it supposed to be an encomium, a eulogy, speaking of how wonderful the person is? That can be an element of the sermon, but it shouldn't be the whole thing. The priest's responsibility, as at all times, is to preach the gospel. And that responsibility is one for which he is ordained, for which he is educated before he is ordained, and which he is given as a sacred duty by the bishop who ordains him on behalf of Christ himself. That is not a responsibility that has been shouldered by an individual, by a member of any family. And therefore, it is a fraught question for the priest then to hand over that responsibility to someone else instead of doing it himself. So again, it's not so much that the family is forbidden to preach, or to speak in the church. It's not about a proscription, it's about a prescription. The priest is supposed to preach the gospel at that point. And then it becomes quickly a practice to say, well, why can't they speak afterwards? Well, then we're going to go from a 45-minute to an hour service to an hour and 15 minutes to an hour and a half service. Not to mention, still, that pulpit is reserved for the preaching of the gospel. Why some priests, although we all have to do it sometimes, some priests refuse to make announcements in the church because the church is for sermons. If we're going to make announcements, we'll do it in the social hall. I don't do that. I doubt you do that, Father, but I've heard it done, and there's some significant meaning to it. That speaking in the church is supposed to be reserved for spiritual things. And if by economy, as a stretching of the rules, we sometimes give announcements in the church, or have the Greek school come up and speak, or anything along these lines. It is different from, we never, in the context of a service, have someone else come up and preach. And that really is the associated there. Now, there's also the practical concern, which kind of illustrates that. Sometimes people who are grieving say things that simply aren't true, things that are unorthodox. I made the joke about now his soul is with the stars. That was said at a funeral that I attended. I wasn't officiating. It was in an Orthodox church, and the priest, I don't think it was even a Greek Orthodox church, but it was 15 years ago. The priest, for some reason, allowed someone to stand up and speak, and they said that the soul of the departed was now in the stars. That's not the Orthodox tradition. That's not our belief. Frankly, that's heresy. The soul goes to paradise, to the place of the dead, to the embrace of Abraham, to wait for the resurrection in the presence of the Lord, whose life now fills the place of death. They do not go to be with the stars. There's Job, the new constellation. It's not really how it works. Or sometimes other things. People who are grieving will say many things. Sometimes they make inappropriate jokes about, Uncle Bob was a great fellow, but we had 3 beers in him. Oh, watch him with the ladies. What's his name? Yeah, was that? Okay. So, these are the problems associated with someone who is not the priest speaking at the funeral service. So let's see, cremation, speaking, closed casket. Oftentimes, and really more often than the other two, that's the request that I've gotten, not at St. George, but in some other parishes sometimes, people who really, really, really want the closed casket. I've known a closed casket to be permitted by the bishop on one occasion. And it was a tragic case of a husband and wife who were flying their private plane in western New York and crashed. And their bodies were recovered from the wreckage, but they were not in any condition to be displayed. So in fact, the bishop allowed those bodies to be cremated, but then that urn containing their remains was placed in a casket which was closed. That is the sort of circumstance under which you can allow that sort of exception, where the body has been destroyed to that degree. So, I guess you could say something similar in the case of those who lost their lives on September 11th. There were Orthodox Christians among them, and if their bodies were recovered, they were certainly not recovered whole. In those circumstances, then, what we have is buried. But sometimes, the requests I've gotten have been more along the lines of, she insisted that her casket be closed. I've heard, she demanded it. Usually they don't say, They say, Grandma, she insisted that her casket be closed. Why? I said, she didn't want anyone looking at her. Why? because she didn't really like how she looked in life, and she's sure she'll look worse in death. Probably. That's kind of the point. We don't look good when we're dead. We're not supposed to. Death is bad. We're supposed to come to terms with this. But then those are the difficult conversations. Or another example, not an Orthodox example. Sometimes, especially in the South, it seems, sometimes people will plan their own funerals. Hymns will be sung in this or that Baptist church or Presbyterian church. What hymns will be sung, what preacher will preach, what church will be done in, what kind of casket they'll have, what clothes they'll wear. And sometimes the choice of clothes isn't necessarily practical. If your prettiest garment is a nightgown, then it may or may not be somewhat transparent, and there may or may not be deep issues of inappropriateness in the funeral as it proceeds. And then sometimes you want the casket closed because of this, but why not let someone else take it? Anyway, the point being, vanity has no place in the funeral service, and oftentimes that is the motivation behind the desire to have a closed casket. There have been times, and these are more difficult to deal with, and on these occasions sometimes I have asked for an exception to that rule, where the family had had a bad experience. Maybe they had young children, maybe the children really freaked out, maybe the family were not dealing well with grief themselves, and in those circumstances to see that there might be problems. And when that question has come to me, I don't think the kids will be able to handle it. They were traumatized for months after, the other grandparent died. On those occasions, well, now I'm nervous because I could be coaching all of you on how to ask this question in a way that would be perhaps answered. But understand that the motivation is important. What we intend, what we understand from these things matters. And that is ultimately why there are these rules, so that we approach death in an appropriate way. Not fearing it, but not shying away from an encounter with mankind's most ancient and implacable enemy in his moment of triumph. We are called to face death, to look death in the eye, and then to look at Christ, not to fight with death ourselves, but to look to Christ for hope, for salvation, and for victory, in the full confidence that that victory will come. So a comment that I often make at a funeral is that when we stand in a funeral service, we stand on the threshold of eternity. We stand on the near side of a door through which we can see the resurrection. Because we have that casket in which a baptized, chrismated, confessed, and communed Orthodox Christian lies dead. Someone who died in the hope of the resurrection lies in a box, and we close that box for the last time. But the next time that box opens, barring some need to exhume the body and see why they died or something, if sometimes happens, the next time that box is opened will be on the day of the resurrection. And when that human being's eyes open again, they will look on the face of Christ. When they climb out of that box and stand on the earth, they will see it renewed and restored, perfected, made into the temple of the Most High God. And that is a striking thing. A genuine cause for hope, and even for joy in the midst of sorrow. And that is what the funeral service ultimately gives to us. It brings us through the ringer. Read the service sometime. The hymns that are sung after the Obligataria are not all sweetness and light. There is no, how many of you are familiar with the hymns of Fanny Crosby? There's a Protestant woman from 100 years ago. Blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. They're kind of cheesy. Anyway, there's nothing cheesy about the Orthodox hymns of the funeral. They will break your heart, even if you haven't lost a loved one. But then moving through that, we hear Paul speak of grief that is still filled with hope. We hear Christ himself speak of the resurrection of the dead. We hear him say that very soon even the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. We see the icon of Christ in Hades. And we anoint our loved one with wine, not with wine, with oil and with earth. We say, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and all who dwell on it. You are earth, and to the earth you shall return, with full knowledge that the earth will be restored by Christ. And then as we bring them out, well, not as we bring them out, sometimes this is done, but we sing there, blessed is the way on which you travel today, for there is prepared for you a place of everlasting rest. And we bury them in expectation of the resurrection. It is the most perfect blend of absolute sorrow and everlasting joy. And it is worth a few proscriptions for the sake of the prescription. This is how we mourn. This is how we grieve. This is how we say goodbye. And this is how we hope. And if we understand the positive purpose and meaning of the funeral service, whatever preferences we may have had about maybe it would be nice to do it this way or that way, if they don't fit within that prescription, I think it's easier to accept that and to follow the clearly defined lines that the Church sets out for us in terms of how to move through that deep loss. That is about all I had. Although I might express that this is not something that, I might add one final thing, that there is something of a movement towards a green funeral, which probably you all have heard of, which doesn't involve the, essentially the mummification of the body. This is done in most funeral homes. And it seems to be picking up steam in a certain sense. That process of preparing the body is perhaps the one thing that we should understand is absent from the Orthodox tradition. Not that it's bad necessarily, but it can become a problem. In this, I am expressing my personal opinion and not anything that is an active concern of the Church. But sometimes the preparation of the body, the embalming, there we go. The embalming process is the largest expense of a burial, and sometimes there is a financial concern. Sometimes cremation is raised for those reasons, and it may on some occasions be worthwhile to look at other options that might ultimately be more in keeping with the ancient tradition of the Church. But that's my speculation, my opinion, not me speaking for the Church. So probably shouldn't have said it all. I'm sorry. Anyway, questions? Is it all right if there were questions?
Please.
Okay.
Could you repeat the questions?
Yes. The question is, should a cross be removed from the the body of the deceased before the burial is done. I've heard that sort of thing myself, but I haven't heard it from an ecclesiastical source. Have you found it?
Not about the cross. I've heard about people with icons that want to be buried with icons. I heard a priest once say no to the icon. The cross is a symbol of something.
The cross is a symbol of the resurrection. It seems like an appropriate thing to maybe bury with them. I can think of a funeral of a priest where he had, his cross on, and it was removed before the burial, but I don't think it was because it was inappropriate for it to be buried with him, but rather because his family wanted to make a gift of it to the priest who buried him, and that was very meaningful. So, the reality is there are sometimes odd, not necessarily odd, there are regional traditions, and sometimes it may just come from one priest who said, no, don't bury that cross with them. That cross they wanted to give to someone else, or this or that, and then from that we can extrapolate a rule that gets passed down from yaya to yaya, if you will, and can take on a life of its own. I haven't heard that, though. And some of it is perhaps even to the discretion of the individual priest. I know I've had people ask me the question about icons, and I couldn't think of a reason not to, in a certain sense. I couldn't think of a reason to bury the icon of the deceased. It can feel a little bit superstitious in a certain sense. The point of the icon is to be venerated, not to be a talisman of anything like that. The cross is worn around the neck as a sign of the hope of the resurrection. So I would probably discourage putting the icon in. I don't think it's an absolute thing. I would be okay with the cross. Speaking my own opinion. Other questions? Yes. The question is, where did the custom of putting flowers on the casket at the cemetery, where did that come from? I can't speak with confidence of that. I know that a lot of the American funeral practice is something that was really invented to a certain degree by the funeral home industry in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and it seems every 20 or 30 years someone writes a book excoriating the practices of the funeral homes. For myself, the funeral directors I've encountered have always been very pastoral, very caring individuals, so I don't want to speak against them. But I know sometimes the flowers and the multitude of flowers that are present at funeral homes, that can't be an ancient tradition, just because where would you get that many flowers in that, so perfectly uniform as it were. On the same token, I think there are accounts of flowers being present at maybe imperial funerals in the Roman period, or the Byzantine period. So my guess, understanding I haven't made a study of flowers in the funeral service as such, but my guess would be that it's something that has become normative in funeral services really only in the last 150 years at the most in the United States, and then perhaps going from here elsewhere in the world. But that wasn't necessarily normative at all times in all places.
How about in the church?
Flowers in the church?
I know it's done, but if I'm not mistaken, I think when the bishop is presiding, he does not want flowers on the casket.
He doesn't want flowers on the casket. And I haven't heard His Eminence speak about why he doesn't like that, but I know he dislikes it.
It's for the reasons you gave. He wants to see the face of the person.
That was
as he's praying.
what I was going to guess. And I should have mentioned this, but it is kind of interesting. I said that the deceased always faces towards the altar. But there is an exception to that. That most of you probably have experienced in the funeral of a priest. The casket faces the other direction, and the priest faces the people, because that's his position in the church. And now there may be variation about that, but that's what I know I saw Father Stephen Anthony's funeral. And oftentimes, I learned this from Father Dean, his hand is even formed in the blessing. And when a priest is buried, a liturgy is done before the funeral, his last liturgy. So he stands there and he blesses, and the priest who celebrates them celebrates on his behalf. It can feel a little macabre, but it can also feel beautiful. Anyway. But yes, what Father Coates has said is that the bishop doesn't like the flowers on top of the casket because he wants to see the face of the deceased, and it's important that the face of the deceased be able, if their eyes were open, to see the church. They're not an object within the church. They are the remains of a living sacrament of God within the church for the last time before the resurrection. I'm sorry, there was another hand, and I kept on talking. Yes?
I have a question about the Stephanus.
The Stephanus?
Yes. Am I correct in understanding that it should be buried with the second last spouse?
I've heard that tradition, that the second of the spouses to deceased should be buried with the Stephanus. I've also heard that, I suspect this is a regional thing. I've heard of the ribbon that joins the Stephanus finally being cut when the first dies, and the one crown or one Stephanus will be placed in the casket with them, and the other with the second to fall asleep. But that is, I think, a common tradition, not necessarily a requirement, but something that is often done. And really it expresses, in either sense, the expectation of the church. There may be some controversy about this, but there are certainly those in the church, and I believe it's the normative position, that Orthodox marriage is not understood to end at death, but it is a union that is intended, not guaranteed, but it is intended to continue into the resurrection, not necessarily as a physical relationship. What that becomes beyond the bounds of talking about the funeral, but burying the Stephanus with a wedded couple is an expression of that hope, that expectation, understanding that the union of marriage is more than a legal, physical union, but is a deep union of two persons in the image of the love that unites the persons of the Holy Trinity, not to be misunderstood or taken too far, but understood that we are to love one another in a self-emptying fashion, and that marriage in its fulfillment is supposed to be like that, and therefore we can bury the Stephanus with them in that way. But, again, going beyond the bounds of the death that we're supposed to talk about tonight. Yes? Yes. My answer would be to say that the church married you, and married you on the basis of both spouses at least being Christians. That is the requirement. Where that is present, then again, there's no guarantee of any of this. Marry a couple and say, we'll be married into eternity. We say you are called to love one another in Christ, so that your union transcends death. And in marrying you, the church, I think, clarifies that that model is as much yours as anyone else's.
Well, to add, maybe, were you going to add something?
I was going to say, I meant it for practice.
Like a memorial service or?
Yes, yeah.
Funeral service is really important to me,
Right.
but I don't think I get that much.
Thank you, Father. I misunderstood the question. I apologize. That question is kind of where there can be some gray area. I've seen that on occasion. I'm sure you have too, Father. The technical answer is, a non-Orthodox Christian cannot be buried in the church. Period. However, there is a service for an Orthodox priest to do for a non-Orthodox Christian if there is no clergyman of their denomination present to do the service, which one would have to have permission from the bishop to use. It's not something that is allowed automatically. And then that service has elements that are removed. Probably, again, this is where you get into some of the gray area. Because let's say that there is a family. Let's step away from that question to the more really intense issue of cremation. Oftentimes, a family will say, or a member of a family, the member who remains active in the church will say, my field pastor died. He wanted to be cremated, or even worse, the family has chosen to cremate him. I've been outvoted. Can you at least come to the funeral home and do something? Can you not leave him without the embrace of the church in some sense? And then there's a process of conversation you would ask. I would ask, and again, this then becomes the personal pastoral discretion of the priest with the permission in a specific sense each time of the bishop. I would ask, what was your Theo's wishes? What are your wishes? Figure out a little bit who is making the decision for the cremation. Did the deceased, if the deceased wanted to be cremated, did he know that he was violating the direction of the church? Did he understand what the point of that direction was? And you can ask a lot of these questions. And depending on the answers, I have been given permission on a few occasions to go to the cemetery or go to the funeral home and do a Trisagion service for someone who had been cremated. Usually in those cases, we ask the family to not announce that publicly, not publish it in the newspaper. We're doing it for the family or for the individual in the family who remains close to the church, as much for their sake as for the deceased. But it's not a rule. You can't say, well, you can do it yourself for anybody. Although, oftentimes, the rules are looser for Trisagion services. But, so there is that at the very least. And then the fact that that service exists implies that there have been times where an Orthodox priest has done the funeral for someone who was not baptized and chrismated in the Orthodox Church. I haven't had that issue actually come up. I know of couples in the churches that I've served, who were going to be facing that. And again, I can say this probably because I haven't had the conversation with the bishop. That is a case where I, as the priest, would ask the bishop for permission to do the service for the non-Orthodox spouse. I don't know whether he would say yes. I haven't had the conversation with him. But in that case, because oftentimes in those cases, the non-Orthodox spouse has lived their life as a member of the church. They don't have a relationship with any other pastor, with any other church. They have functioned as a part of the local community. What am I going to do? Call the Presbyterian pastor down the road and say, will you do the funeral for this guy? I think he was baptized in your church 70 years ago, but he hasn't gone for ages. He's been coming to my church. I'm not allowed to. It starts to feel like a ridiculous conversation. Again, I don't know what the bishop would say. I can't make any guarantees. The expectation remains that positive prescription. Someone who's living their life in the Orthodox Church should become Orthodox. They should embrace and be embraced by the Church in full. If they're not there yet, if that's not possible for them, then we deal with the world as we find it. And I've always found the Church to be pastoral and understanding and loving, so long as communication is broken. It doesn't mean I always got what I wanted. It doesn't mean that anyone ever gets what they want. But our responsibility is to be loving, and I would be hopeful. Does that sound about correct, Mother? If you'd like to add or subtract anything? Yes.
How much of the burial is controlled by law?
How much of the burial?
Yes.
Less than you would think. Are you talking specifically about the question of the green funeral?
Where can you be buried, for example, under what conditions, what casket requirements are there, location, whether you need to be embalmed to begin with, all sorts of questions of that variety that had to do with procedure.
The question is how much of the burial procedure is defined by law. I'm not competent to answer that question in a detailed fashion. There's a book that was put out a few years ago by an Orthodox layperson who had been working very hard to establish a Father, cut me off at any point. Essentially what they've been doing is in their local parish, they're in India, Antiochian, I'm sure, very small community, very intimate. They've established a little committee, and every time a member of the parish dies, instead of calling the funeral home, these members go themselves, they wash the remains, they dress them, they prepare them themselves, and then very quickly, because they're not embalming, they bring them to the church, and then within 24 to 48 hours, they've accomplished the burial. I know that that's been done in several states. I know that sometimes people who ask that question when they go to a funeral home have been told things that are simply not true. I've read that both in Orthodox sources and in secular sources, 150 years ago. So certainly there are laws about where human remains are allowed to go and how they are to be treated and disposed of. They are, broadly speaking, I think I can say, not as stringent as we often understand and expect them to be. And that kind of becomes an interesting reality, that any individual's experience of the funeral is an interesting intersection of what the church expects and what the societal expectations are and what the funeral home business at large, not me specific, again, because I've had nothing but good experiences with funeral homes and funeral directors, but they are not necessarily, they have to make a living somewhere. And in those cases, I know that there have been people who have been told that there's a requirement for the big concrete vault, a requirement for this or that kind of casket, a requirement that the individual be involved. And I know for a fact in New York State, where usually the regulations are more intense and less intense, I did a funeral for a woman who was buried in a pine box in one of the major cemeteries. It was still handled by a funeral home. She wasn't involved. I did it for I did it at the other parish because the priest there was out of town. But it was in every way a traditional, what a funeral would look like 200 years ago. They had a grave shroud covering her face because she hadn't been prepared. Her eyes were closed, but her jaw was open. And in a certain sense, it was much more disturbing to see death that starkly. On the other, it was deeply moving as well. The service made more sense in that context. That's not the question you were asking. But, long story short is, I don't think they're as strict as we think they are. But if you want, I can find a copy of the book or books that I've seen referencing this. But now I'm going to get in trouble, and the bishop's going to call me and say, Father Anthony, you started a trend, and everyone wants to do these green funerals, and the funeral director's yelling at me, so now I'm going to be in trouble. Anything else? Okay. Thank you all very much. It's always a pleasure to be in Ann Arbor. Thank you, Father.
May I offer one thing? This is just as a pastoral comment from myself to the congregation that I've been charged with and to the visitors who are here as well. When it comes to the certain preparations that are expected through family tradition, local custom, whatever it may be, may I offer this advice. If it's not your loved one, if it's not your father, your mother, your child, or the immediate relative, please stay out of it. Because so many people start to get involved with other people's funerals and say, we want this to happen, we need this, otherwise they're not going to go to heaven. They're going to wander for 40 days until the memorial. All these crazy things are said by people, some people, to people who are grieving, who have just suffered a loss. And most of these things have really nothing to do with the funeral service itself or with really what the church believes. So when someone passes and the family is grieving, if they have questions, push them to talk to the priest about the proper way to begin the preparations for the funeral service itself. And please, stay out. I'm talking to people who already do that and they don't bother with these things. But I've dealt with that on a number of occasions, and it becomes very difficult because the distressed person has been told by someone that this is what I have to do. And that person is beloved to them. And what do you do at that point? It puts needless worry and extra stress on that person at that time. So that was just one thing I wanted to add from my personal experience. So, Father, thank you very, very much for your presentation. I think we all appreciated it very, very well. And if I may say, I think this is by far the best of the 5 presentations. Thank you very, very much, Brother Anthony. And I hope you get a chance to at least say hello to him before he leaves. Thank you all very much for coming.